The first step granted knowledge. This was a place of divine neutrality, a universal scalpel capable of excising the tumor of this place's many influences. The second step cut away the influences of the forest and the mist and the traitor and the dark, at least as much as it could. Her apocalyptic glow remained, casting it the steps in the tones of bloodshed. The skull in her hands, however, was a thing of the forest, and it was split, a long crack spreading along its surface. What a waste. She had so much planned for it. Pain interrupted her lamentations. An unfamiliar sensation. A sharp edge of the split skull had torn into her finger. Her beast bounded towards the temple, boosters burning like pyres, and its reactors splitting matter to fuel its rage. It was prone to overreaction. She sedated it with a thought. It collapsed like a fell heart, reactors dying and servos locking up. A single mote of liquid darkness fell from the wound and onto the skull's broken halves, running along its edges and dropping onto the steps. The skull had changed, feeding on her ichor and becoming a thing of that dark sea. Its teeth grew strange and sharp. The bone shimmered, and something began to grow on it, beyond perception. Perhaps its potential was not lost. She turned back to the stairs. The third step tasted her intentions. She wished to make a palace of the temple, its altar becoming a throne where the warbands who rampaged across the forest could be brought to heel should they defy her. It also tasted her blood, and the knife was raised again in response. The fourth step cast her out before she reached it. There was no fight. She simply found herself once more within her beast in an unfamiliar woodland. A river snaked between the trees and broke the silence. She stepped into it, leaving the war machine to prowl the woodland whilst her aura faded back to a gentle gray. She admired the skull in her hands, wondering what would become of it. Something disturbed her. From beyond the far bank, within a thick mist, she heard voices. They spoke in a long-dead language of Earth. They spoke of their king, a fierce warrior and brilliant tactician. Occasionally, she would glimpse men dressed in blue and gold with primitive weapons. Though she was here on his behalf, a parley with a fellow royal, no matter how inferior, would do little harm and would lift her spirits after the incident at the temple. Her laughter danced across the shadows of the river and pierced the fog, no doubt alerting sentries as she imagined their meeting and called her beast back to her side. Norio and his warriors continued pressing on, the noises of the battle that had driven them forward dying down behind them. Not that it was much comfort. They had barely had a chance to stop and rest, so the aches that had been working their way up their legs were now blooming into something painful. They would need to stop soon. Praying under his breath, Norio hoped for a sign. It was then that a picturesque small opening, bisected by a stream, revealed itself, bringing a smile to those who had gathered. A perfect place to rest. Gosoro and Naoki rushed to the water, while Norio and Kaeda drank in their surroundings. Choriichi, meanwhile, breathed in the fresh air, earthy and floral scents, and something else. Something familiar. Blood. Human. Fresh. The others quickly followed suit. The sign of one of their own walking with purpose while sniffing the air piqued their curiosity. They quickly found the source shortly upstream, amongst several footprints and drag marks. Examining the scene, they all built a picture of what had happened. 3 or 4 humans, multiple injured, tending to wounds before moving on. An unwelcome thought started to creep in amongst them. Valgoruso was the first to speak. "Do you think they'll return?" he asked, turning to his leader. Norio mulled the question for a moment. "Unlikely. One does not run in their condition unless they have to. But as to what they are running from," he trailed off. Fortifying their position with sharpened barricades, the group settled in for a while, snacking on what they could find, their minds drifting as they tuned out the noises around them. Only snapping back to their senses with the sound of pained bleating. A deer-like creature had gotten impaled on one of their defenses. It was promptly put out of its misery. While the others relished in their newly gifted meal, Norio pondered why it was there in the first place. They hadn't seen or heard anything that could have spooked it, and the fact it had ran straight at them, it had to be a message from Matanushi. But what? The scent of skewered cooked meat being waved in front of him snapped him back to his senses. Biting into the food, he turned the stick in his hand, and a thought popped into his head. The barricades! They had brought civilization to the wilds. Matanushi's wilds. Of course! The deer wasn't a gift, it was a warning. Norio thought of getting up and destroying them, leaving the deer as an offering and leading his warriors forward, but stopped himself. After all the work they had put into making them on aching legs, they needed the rest. And the last thing he wanted to do was make Matanushi angrier by wasting the deer's life. No, they would tear it all down before they leave. He'd have to explain it to the others, but they would understand. No one wants to anger a goddess. But for now, the Ogroni sat and feasted, readying for the trials ahead. Elf meat didn't taste good. There was something sickly sweet about it. But Golta and her knights each swallowed a mouthful without complaint. This wasn't their meal, of course. Each knight had a suitable amount of rations and the means to produce more. This was a ceremonial gesture, symbolizing the act of predation and the flow of energy through the ecosystem. Golta had eaten far worse in the past, and judging by what she had briefly seen of the other champions, she suspected she would have to eat far worse in the future as well. The rest of the corpses, those that weren't consumed by the Fangmoor earlier, were piled up and used as a catalyst to summon the Undermire. By the middle of the day, the whole area was covered in patches of oozing swampland. In the center of the conjured mire was a tangled mat of roots and branches that had grown into a simple palisade. It was a light fortification, but it would act as a useful anchor point for the Undermire to spread. When the fortification was finished and the area secure, the surviving knights continued their campaign further into the forest. There was a sullen mood hanging over them, a sense of profound emptiness. It wasn't grief. Death was a celebrated natural process in the Undermire. It was something more than that. Some new, kinda slow, creeping oblivion. It didn't matter. Golta's company simply pushed on, doing their best to ignore the whispering in the fog. There was no denying it. Those that called this forest home were toying with King Charles and the rest of the army. He was certain they had only been marching for mere hours. Yet with this mystical fog, all sense of time was beginning to fade. It certainly didn't help that they could barely see up to a few feet in any direction, ensuring that some of the men did not even know which direction they were going. Fortunately, the efforts of the scouts were proving to be a godsend in ensuring they did not stray from the tested path. Though, at this rate, no one would mind if they ended up back at the stockade, just as long as they got out of this thrice-damned fog. Regardless, the king remained hopeful. For unless they were in the depths of hell unknowingly, even this fog couldn't last forever. Nevertheless, with a little encouragement from the priest, he decided a quick prayer wouldn't hurt. O merciful Lord, if thou can hear me, and art willing, guide us, your faithful servants, out of this fog, so that we may continue the task thou hast bestowed upon us. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. With that, the king urged his horse forward, steadily making his way to the front of the column, just in time to hear a noise he did not expect. It was laughter. The melodious laughter of a woman. He looked around confused for but a moment before an officer spoke. Am I hearing things? Not unless I am too. There it was again, but this time it was far clearer and coming from a singular direction. This was either a trick of the forest, or one of the other parties that had arrived here was nearby. There was only one way to find out. Without a moment's hesitation, he bade the troops to move. Follow that laughter! This proved to be the right call, for within an hour of marching, they finally cleared the fog, and the source of the laughter was discovered. A woman of beauty unparalleled stood a distance away from them. Behind her, a behemoth made of metals unknown to them. One thing King Charles noticed was that she was heading his way without the giant in tow. Clearly she wished to talk, and since she more or less guided them out of the fog, the least he could do was hear what she had to say. After some marching through the forest, Buddy and his expedition emerged from the trees and entered a clearing. Before them stood a small pyramid made out of simple stone slabs. Buddy could not help but notice the hesitation among his troop. Most were either nervously looking around or looking at the pyramid with fear. They had just run into swamp warriors. What if this structure was a temple where they made human sacrifices to their wicked god? Or perhaps this building was connected to some other horror native to this realm. Buddy did not know. How could he? The expedition leader could well understand the concerns of his militiamen. But this was an unknown world that was clearly magical in some ways. Perhaps this building could give him some answers into this world, bestow some boon on his troops, or even help bring their fallen back to life. Buddy had to try and see. After his previous failures, he owed that much to his fellow elves. In the end, Buddy walked up to the temple alone, but with his troops close. When he entered it and beheld the altar, he had some weird out-of-body experience, but nothing else happened. Hoping that this was not a bad thing, he decided that it would be safer if his troops did not enter the temple. Instead, he ordered them to make camp in the clearing for the night. Tomorrow, they would continue exploring this world. But after the previous struggles, the expedition really needed some rest. Operation Nevergreen, Report 2. We engaged in direct contact with the lycanthropes. The terrain proved extremely disadvantaged to us. The enemy forces remained steadfast within clouds of thick fog where we could only indirectly bombard them. Other ranged weaponry was incapable of piercing the fog. We could only bring down one of their troops at the start of the engagement when we noticed them approaching, before they reached the fog. For as long as we could, we held out along the flanks of the fog cloud in which the enemy resided. Lesaith attempted to lure the enemy out, but we were caught off guard. One of theirs materialized behind us and attacked the Vespers. I drove him back with rapid gunfire, but was unable to neutralize the threat entirely. Not risking any more losses, we retreated immediately. Combat Log. Allied combatants: Captain Vega Iridian, active. Lesaith Leonis, active. Sirocco, active. Nashira Sigjian, KIA. Rastaban Sijian, KIA. Enemy combatants: unknown number. 1 confirmed casualty. We were not followed on our retreat, giving us time to recuperate. None of our survivors have sustained any wounds. The mood has changed dramatically for the worse. Losses were expected, but hit hard nonetheless. Alas, there is no time to mourn. Our Arx Lumini equipment caught the telepathic presence of 2 entities nearby. We have no reason to suspect hostile intentions, but will approach with necessary caution regardless. Operation Nevergreen repeats its request for additional manpower. We need resilience and firepower immediately. Signed, Captain Vega Iridian, the Cygnus.